Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to inform you that the BBC, the UK's public broadcaster, has inched closer to its sad demise. That's because its shameful action today to appease its Israeli masters has truly killed the corporation's reputation as a so called independent media organization. Even though the BBC has badly tarnished its credentials during its coverage of the Gaza conflict, what happened today will shock every single license fee payer in the UK. This also shows that the BBC is no longer controlled by British taxpayers, but by Zionists on the payroll of Israeli war criminals. BBC presenter Anita McVeigh, who was in full form yesterday, when she appeared very concerned about the psychological impact on Israeli soldiers released from the Hamas captivity. She had no such concern for Palestinian hostages being released the same day from Israeli concentration camps.
Israeli military forces who will then transport them to meet their loved ones in this kibbutz on the edge of Gaza in southern Israel before they are taken by military helicopter to the hospitals where they will undergo further medical checks and psychological testing as well.
Yes, because although we've seen images of huge relief on their faces, smiles on their faces, the families of the hostages absolutely elated to be reunited with their loved ones. There is that moment of joy, but being held in captivity for 15 months is not something that most of us can imagine, and that will take a long period of recovery, apart from the physical recovery, the mental recovery as well.
She had then gone on to allege that Hamas and other Palestinian groups were indulging in propaganda by staging an event to release Israeli captives. So much for BBC's impartiality. But today, BBC viewers were truly stunned to see the same Anita McVeigh appearing on TV to issue an unconditional apology to Israelis. Yes, an unconditional apology on BBC TV. You know for what? For calling Israeli hostages prisoners. That's all. That's all the BBC had done. BBC had inadvertently called those being released from Hamas captivity prisoners. Within hours, BBC was airing a full-blown apology from its main channel.
And earlier today on BBC News, we reported on the release of the names of those 3 Israeli hostages who are due to be freed tomorrow. At one point in our coverage, we mistakenly called the hostages prisoners, and we would like to apologise for that error.
If you and I were to complain about some of the BBC coverage, they would come back to you with their standard response after several days. But because this concerned Israelis, the response from the BBC was swift and powerful. This will give you an indication of who now controls the editorial decisions of an organization which should be catering to the interest of the British public. The same BBC has not apologized even once for its sustained anti-Palestinian propaganda. The corporation did not apologize when it used this headline to report on the brutal slaughtering of 6-year-old Hind Rajab. Israeli terrorists had fired more than 300 rounds of bullets to kill this 6-year-old angel. But the BBC's headline had read, Hind Rajab 6 found dead in Gaza days after phone calls for help. No mention of who killed her. Such was the journalistic fraud that the BBC did not even use the word killed, let alone mentioning Israel behind her murder. BBC has not apologized till today and not even changed its headline to accurately reflect that facts. Then the BBC wrote this in its headline: when Israeli terrorists unleashed dogs at a Palestinian boy with Down syndrome. Israelis had prevented Mohammed Bahar's family from attending to their child even when Israeli dogs were mauling him to death. They were not even allowed to visit the murder site for at least a week after Mohammed Bahar was killed. And yet, the BBC headline had read, The Lonely Death of Gaza Man with Down Syndrome. As expected, there was a global outcry to this journalistic fraud committed by the BBC. Faced with growing outrage, this fraud organization had then changed the headline to this: Gaza man with Down syndrome attacked by IDF dog and left to die. Mother says. Can you see the fraud here? Even here, it attributes the news to the victim's mother, when there was absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind about who his killers were. To take a moral high ground, the BBC had clarified. This post replaces an earlier version in order to update a headline that more accurately represents the article. Has the BBC apologized for this and other fraud? No. Has the BBC apologized to millions of Palestinians for describing them as prisoners when they are often picked up arbitrarily by Israelis? These Palestinians then are made to languish in Israeli concentration camps for years. Don't go too far in the past. Can someone ask the Zionist owners of the BBC how this publicly funded organization should address Palestinian doctor Hussam Abu Safia, whose fate is still not known to anyone after he was held hostage by Israelis several months ago? Not too long ago, BBC presenter had abruptly ended his interview with his reporter after he disagreed with him on the well-being of Israeli soldiers in Hamas captivity.
So, Sebastian, we can now see there are some women who have been brought out. Let's just have a listen to the sound that we can hear from there, because there are, of course, a lot of people there in Palestine Square in Gaza City, and lots of cameras up taking pictures. Those women there do seem to be smiling on their faces, but they're being walked, surrounded by those Hamas fighters, over to the Red Cross vehicles. You can see that they are having their flags, and they're actually now moving them up to the stage. And Sebastian, this must be a really difficult time for those hostages as they are paraded by the Hamas fighters.
Well, I mean, there must be a huge amount of emotions, obviously, that are going through their heads. I mean, more than anything is happiness that they are being released. I mean, we're seeing that on their faces now. You'll see that they are all dressed in their army fatigues. They all look in good health, it has to be said. They're walking together.
Yes, so you can
watch the full video here. Then last year we saw Sky News taking its presenter Bel Donati off air for just asking difficult questions to an Israeli spokesperson, now the Israeli ambassador in the United Nations. She was later sacked by Sky News.
Yes, you've made your point. You've also departed from the original question. Let's just take you back to these. One of the provisional measures is about the incitement.
Guarantee that we will eradicate Hamas.
Right, okay, yes, absolutely. You've doubled down on those public comments. You've called for a voluntary migration of Palestinians from Gaza. In November, you co-authored a piece that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. You suggested the ethnic cleansing of some of Gaza's population to Western countries that would accept the refugees. The exact quote from that article: one idea is for countries around the world to accept limited numbers of Gazan families who have expressed a desire to relocate. Do you stand by those statements?
You know, ethnic cleansing, that's a word you used. If you read my article, I spoke about voluntary immigration.
I read that article. I did read that article, and I've just quoted from it.
Let me remind you that you spoke about ethnic cleansing. I spoke about voluntary immigration. And I think anyone in the world who voluntarily wants to move to another country should be eligible to do that. But you know what? It's not the first time that we hear those allegations.
The sort of voluntary relocation of many Jewish people during the Holocaust, I imagine. It is not voluntary relocation.
Shame on you for that comparison.
Let us please,
That's a shameful anti-Semitic equation.
Let us please go to the subjective.
I will not allow you to speak about the Holocaust.
You said earlier.
This is pure anti-Semitism, what you just said.
Mr. Danon,
the Holocaust to what's happening today in Gaza.
Mr. Danon, you talked about eradicating Hamas.
Shame on you for this behavior. Shame on you for this equation. You should apologize for what you just said on record about the Holocaust. How can you even compare that?
This just shows the control Israelis wield on the British media. As for the BBC, the examples of its journalistic fraud are in plenty. I've been exposing this organization, my former employer, regularly. Just search BBC Gaza Rifat Jawaid on YouTube and you will find all those videos. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your support of this platform and our journalism on buymeacoffee.com and Patreon. If you do think that our journalism is worth supporting, then you too should consider becoming part of it. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.